So, Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Again, the concepts that we're focusing on, I'm going to work our way through so you can kind of keep pace with where we are in the talk by where we are on these concepts. And so essentially I'm going to be teaching the background about him so that we can understand the prologue, at least, to Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and this kind of language that he's using. But you can also use this as a way of kind of keeping track of where we are. And my goal is 20 minutes or thereabouts. So we'll see. I have a lot of goals in life, along with like feeding the hungry and ending famine and world peace, stuff like that. So we'll see how this fits into that. So we have these terms here, the higher man. And again, when he's talking about the higher man, don't focus on just, oh, he's talking about men. No, he's talking about people. The idea is higher mankind, the higher nature of mankind, what we are. Herd morality, nihilism, which will be a really important concept. The Übermensch, which you'll hear from time to time, the Overman, the Superman. Affirmation of life, Amor Fati, which we're going to need to know because this is going to also be part of our next series that we're going to talk about with Stoicism. Eternal recurrence, which again is kind of a technical term, but it will look familiar to a lot of you. It's going to look like another thing that you encounter, which is essentially reincarnation, he's talking. The herd, which are like the masses of people, the last man, and then the slave. And the last man and the slave also are pretty technical concepts that are specific to Nietzsche, which are important, but probably won't encounter them much outside of here. So we'll start. So we've got Nietzsche. Nietzsche is born in 1844. He dies in 1900. And those are important dates, not just for his life, but man, a lot of people died in 1900 or thereabouts. Oscar Wilde dies in 1900 as well, and he dies relatively young. So if you're doing the math on this, how old is Nietzsche when he dies? 1844 to 1900? 56 years old. Now that's also kind of a misstatement because he didn't write up until his death. If we recall the story I've told you, he has a mental collapse. Does anybody remember why he has a mental collapse? He wasn't kicking the head from a horse, but he saw somebody beating a horse. And he was walking through all, and essentially this guy was whipping a horse, trying to get the horse to move. And the horse, the more he got whipped, the more he just kind of held his ground and wouldn't move. And so Nietzsche, for some reason, he has a mental break because he sees the scene. He runs over and he hugs the horse. And he's telling the horse, I understand you, I understand you. Which we can look at and say that's crazy, but also the more you know about Nietzsche, yeah, he understands the horse. The more the horse is getting whipped, the more the horse is like, no, I'm not moving. You know? And some of you are like that person. If someone's trying to get you to do something, you're like, I don't care what it is, man. If someone tries to get me to do something, I'm not going to do it. You know? Breathe. You know? Live. No. So he has a mental breakdown in 1889. So I'll put a little asterisk right here. So from 1889 to 1900, the last 11 years of his life, he wasn't able to produce anything. He just sat in a comatose state. And his sister took care of him. So it becomes this question, we've been talking about him all year. And you kind of ask that question, why does he matter? Why does Nietzsche matter? He matters for a number of reasons, not the least of which his influence is absolutely massive. You know, we live a lot by the things he talked about, whether we realize it or not. And Nietzsche wasn't so much a person who kind of told you, here's how you should live. It was more of an observational thing. Here's how people do live, and here are the outcomes of those things. Obviously, he believes that there is a better way to live, but he doesn't go about it in traditional philosophical ways. Like we're going to look at today's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He's writing a narrative. He's telling us a story about a guy named Zarathustra, who was a real person. He's the founder of the Zoroastrian religion, but with some creative liberties that he takes. So, not the least of which because he just has such a massive influence. Secondly, because if you can talk about Nietzsche, well, you sound smart. So for those of you guys who are going off to college, you'll be able to mention Nietzsche, your professor. You can, the professor's talking about something, and you can raise your hand and ask the professor, is this anything like Nietzsche's doctrine of the eternal recurrence? The professor will say, you know about the eternal recurrence. And you say, of course. Which I laugh about because one of my former students did this. He was telling me a story about this. Right? the professor was talking about Nietzsche and Marx, and he said, the professor told him, you'll learn about these things later on in school, and my student raises his hand and says, I've learned about this already. And he asks a question. The professor and him became good friends after this. The professor said, how do you know about this stuff? And of course, what does he say?
I'm a seeker of knowledge.
Yeah, exactly. He gives me almost no credit. He doesn't say, oh, my high school teacher just did. So I planted some weed on him and called his boss and told him he was selling. So he wouldn't. So for Nietzsche philosophy, he writes, it's not a critique of words by means of other words. It's a phrase he uses. He says philosophy should not be a critique of words by using other words. Instead, he says philosophy should be something that facilitates your growth. It's something that causes you to introspect and causes the individual to grow. So philosophy is something that should be practical and usable in real life. And he says that when you grow in that way, you develop an outlook on life, which he says is life-affirming, which we'll get to. Essentially, life-affirming means that, well, that life has a meaning, life has a purpose, there's a reason to go on. The more introspection you do, even in the face of tragedy and even in the face of suffering, if you remember from Frankl, life is going to have some kind of a meaning. So even for just these few reasons, why does Nietzsche matter? Because his influence is massive. So that if you go forward in life, you've got things to talk about. You have some cultural literacy, but also because the things that he teaches and talks about is life-affirming. We're always looking for some way in which school can be practical and usable. Well, there you go. What's more practical and usable than life affirmation? Even in the face of tragedy and suffering, probably not much. So, off we go. So Nietzsche, when he's talking, he says straight off, I'm not writing for the masses. He says, I'm writing for very specific people. And the type of people he's talking about are these folks up here. He refers to them as the higher man, the higher being. And this is the essential audience of Nietzsche. Now, it's one of those things that makes teaching Nietzsche very difficult because I've just walked in here and said to you, this isn't for most of you. But for a couple of you, it is useful. Now, there's also something attractive about that, because if I say to you, guys, this isn't for you, this is for the smart people. So smart people, listen up. What will most people usually do? Yeah, this is for me. It's not designed to just go, oh, okay, well, let me know when I can start listening again. But he does mean this, by the way. He does say that this is for a very specific select group of people who he's going to identify as the higher man. And the higher man, he says, it's the person essentially who's going to transcend social expectations and become their own self. So to master the chaos of life. So the higher person is the person who's going to separate themselves out from the herd. So the higher man is the person who's going to set themselves up and away from the herd. Now he's going to recognize that this is a chaotic being, that there's chaos inside of this person, because you have your natural instincts and you have the things that society kind of expects from you. And he says that essentially a lot of these things have become inverted. There is a natural you, which you can see reflected in the animal kingdom. And then there's this other you that society is kind of creating and trying to use to suppress the real you. He says that the higher man, the higher person, is the person who's going to re-affix that dynamic. That's going to reach back to who they really are through instinct, and is going to now ignore social expectations and what society wants you to do. That doesn't necessarily mean ignore it just because society expects it of you, but instead it's to become the master of your own chaos. So to become the master of your own chaos. He says that that's the mission of life, to master your own chaos. So he separates, he distinguishes between the higher man and the herd. The higher man and the herd. And the herd is essentially the masses of people. Now, the higher person is going to be a stronger person. So what does the herd have to do in order to control the higher person? They got to kind of band together. Now, what's a great way to control people? Reaffix people's mentalities, their psyches, to tell them what they should and shouldn't want. Think of it as morality. So they use herd morality. Herd morality is essentially the masses trying to lead people around by the nose to tell them, here's what you should do, here's what you shouldn't do. Should you dominate people? No, that's bad. You shouldn't do that. Should you become the best that you possibly can? No, 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 because that makes people feel bad. And then we'll use morality to try to drag down that person. Essentially, this type of morality, it convinces the weak. It convinces the weak that their weakness is actually strength. It convinces the weak that their weakness is actually strength. It essentially says that weakness and obedience is a virtue. And you can see this play out today. You're walking through school and someone punches you in the face. What are you supposed to do? Cower, flee, and go find an adult. Now, if that student comes over, and if you guys come and find me, and I say, a student punched you, well, that's unacceptable. And I go over to that student and I say, did you punch this student? And the student responds by punching me in the face. What am I supposed to do? Cower, flee, and go find an administrator. Which, by the way, we recently got our policies and procedures updated. That if we see two students fighting, as teachers, we're not supposed to get involved. We're not supposed to try to separate them. We're supposed to go find an administrator. Or go find a campus. Now, I'm not joking. I can show you the email. Yeah, I think back to a few years ago. There was a fight on some stairs nearby. And I didn't see it happen, but I was told about this later on, that there was one student who was on top of another one and was just pounding on him. And so it was Pelletier, actually. You guys know Mr. Pelletier. Apparently, the story goes, he went running up and he dove and he tackled the student off of the other one because, severe damage. Today, he would get in trouble for doing that. So now we have to go find an administrator. Now the administrator goes over and says, did you just punch these students? So there's me and the student standing next to each other looking very sad. And then that student's like, bam, punches the administrator. Now what does the administrator do? Go find a police officer, call the police. Because this person has now assaulted 3 people. And then then you guys all look at me like, I thought you were supposed to make a fighter, man. I punch bags sometimes. Then other teachers are supposed to sit there and go, wow, Scout showed incredible restraint. That is wonderful. Wow, you were the bigger person. That's good for you. I'm sitting there going, good for me. Good for me. That's her morality. That's the morality that takes weakness and elevates it as a virtue. It takes weakness and it elevates it as a virtue. It idolizes weakness and obedience. And so again, the higher person is the person who, someone punches you, what do? You punch it back. You take control of the situation. So essentially what we do is we acknowledge this kind of a thing, but the herd uses the higher people in a limited sense, by enabling them, like police officers, let's say, okay, well, we're going to let you handle these situations because we don't want to. It goes back to the things I've talked about before, where if you're completely, if you're non-threatening, if you're not dangerous, we look at that today as being a virtue. In fact, we tell even with guys, we should get rid of your toxicity. We should take your nature of what you normally would do, and we have to suppress it. Everybody else, by the way, let your freak flag fly. But if you're a man, we have to kind of suppress those things. Why? Well, because you're dangerous. Clutch the pearls. You're dangerous. You're toxic. You can. This would not be good for society if you were to be unleashed. And so then we especially tell boys, you don't fight. You go find somebody. Same idea here, that we idolize the weak and the obedient. But I'll suggest to you that just because you're not dangerous, that doesn't make you a good person. If you're like some 85-pound beta cuck, you're walking around like fighting is never the answer. That doesn't make you a good person. You just can't. It's like somebody with a 70 IQ walking around saying college is for dummies. Well, of course you think that, because you can't compete at that level. Same idea with physical violence. If you're incapable of physical violence, that doesn't make you a good person by not being violent. It just makes you somebody who's kind of relying on the herd to keep you safe. The higher person, again, doesn't need the herd. That's the idea. This is why I've said before that to live outside of society, you either need to be a god or a beast. Because if you're able to rise above that, then you're not dependent. And this is something that Frankl would talk about as well, the need to become independent, to become your own person, to not need others. Now, can other people be useful? Yes. But the idea is you strip yourself of all of the needs. Just like I was talking about when you descend down into the underworld, that's the place of refinement. That's where you find out what you actually do need. And then you return with only what you need. Remember that. Think of it this way. Whatever is in you that isn't worthy of representing you should be stripped away. Don't keep the things in you that you don't need. Whatever you don't need, let it strip away. Don't be proud. This even includes our insufficiencies. This includes our weaknesses. These things don't make us better people. But if you're someone who's capable of doing horrible, terrible things, and you restrain from it, that is what makes you a good person, because you have the option of doing evil. If you don't have the option of doing evil, refusing to do evil doesn't make you good. It just makes you true to your nature, you might say. So, I'm sorry? Cowardly. Essentially makes you cowardly, because you never developed that ability. So, of course, how is it, take a wild guess, how is it that you become this person? Think back to what we were talking about with regards to the quote, a little drawing up on the board. How do you become that person? What do you have to do, first of all?
Fight back.
Fight back? Close. Other way. Where do you have to go? Up. Yeah, up into the mountains. You have to go into a place of solitude. Solitude. And Nietzsche is huge on solitude. Now think about this. Where do the weak people assemble? Well, down here in society. Why? Well, because the weak people need each other. Why? Oh, because the higher people are out there. So we all have to kind of band together as weaklings in order to survive. And so he says that society is the place that you're going to find the weak masses, and that the weak masses will arrange themselves according to their need for dependence. So whereas the higher person will be able to go live in solitude. And again, solitude can mean going up into the mountains for 7 years. It can mean going away for a long time. It can even mean going up to Cowles Mountain for a few minutes and having, there will be other people up there as well, but to be alone kind of in your thoughts and to have the ability to develop that. If you're around the masses, you never have the ability to develop your own ideas because you're constantly going to be influenced by the masses. So the higher person is the person who's going to separate themselves. So the higher person is the person who's going to separate themselves. Don't miss that. The higher person is the person who's going to separate themselves. Yeah. And when they separate themselves, what are you going to do when you're up there? Well, you're going to ask these deeper questions. Why do I live? Why do I suffer? Why me? These kinds of things. Now, asking those questions is not a bad thing. Coming up with the wrong answers is the bad thing. So when we ask that question, why do I live? Well, better yet, try this. Have you ever been alone in your thoughts and then you just have to kind of erase those from your head? Or any of you that person who just can't stand to be alone? Because when you're alone, those bad thoughts pop into your head. You're like, why do I live? What's the purpose of life? Why am I suffering? Oh my God, I'm overthinking it. That's your true nature. Your true nature is somebody who's going to think those kinds of things. Why this? Why that? But it's the herd mentality which tells you, don't worry about that. Listen to this. Go watch this. You're thinking too much. Check out. Go online, check some stuff out. Stop yourself from thinking about these deeper things. So the higher person is the person who dares to ask themselves these questions. And why is it? Because we're able to recognize that that life is suffering. And the higher person has the courage to face the fact that life is suffering and to find meaning in life despite its tragedy and suffering. Essentially, we need to believe that we suffer for a purpose. And the only way to assemble an answer for that question is to think about it. And so what Nietzsche is going to say is, what's the purpose of life? What's the meaning of life? Nietzsche is going to say, there isn't one. There isn't one. Unless, like Franco says, you come across one. And again, the way you come across it is by thinking about it. But what he will say is that any purpose that's good is one that's going to be, we'll talk more about it later, but it's going to be life affirming. It's not going to be something that's going to cause you to cower back in life and not put yourself out there. Any kind of a philosophy, any kind of an approach to life that causes you to withdraw permanently is not good. Anything that causes you to just say, life is meaningless, is going to be bad. Because the idea that life is meaningless is nihilism. Nihilism is the idea that we suffer and that everything lacks meaning, that there's no meaning. Nihilism is the idea that there is no meaning in life. There's no meaning in your suffering. There's no meaning in the blue wall. There's no meaning in the underworld and the upper worlds. That life has no meaning. And if life has no meaning, what should you do today? End it? It doesn't matter. What should you do tomorrow? Doesn't matter. What should you do next week? Doesn't matter. What happened to you in your past? Why are you like this? It doesn't matter. Nothing matters. And if nothing matters, well, then you're not going to become what you could be. If nothing in life matters, then, well, nothing matters. Scanlon, should I go to college or should I kill myself? Doesn't matter. If we're nihilistic. But that's the eventual end of it. But you can see why this can be so dangerous. It's one of the things that we suffer from today. That is there such a thing as truth? Is there such a thing as reason? Is there such a... Nah, it doesn't matter. Nothing matters. And now, wonder why it is that nihilism is the thing that dominates today, and we've got what we have. Suicide rates are up 70% among younger people. Mental illness, it's not... And by the way, even when we account for people's willingness to seek help, mental illness is still way off of the charts. We have a tendency to think, oh no, people aren't more depressed today than they were in the past. We're just more comfortable talking about it. It's true. We are more comfortable talking about it. But even in terms of self-reporting studies, we find that it's still way off the charts. It's beyond what we'd expect it to be, what it should be. And so Nietzsche would suggest that the reason for that is because nihilism is the thing that dominates our thought processes today. Nothing matters. So if you want your life to take on some meaning, if you want your life to become better, Nietzsche would say that's the first place that the battle has to start. You've got to find that meaning and that purpose. You've got to eliminate nihilism from your life. Questions so far?